It's indeed very kind of you to think of me for this last hour lecture. I have been guilty of being in the field of education for a very long time. I'm using this term guilt rather self-consciously because I have been at odds with the systems through which I passed in my life. As a child in school, I was not comfortable at ease with my school. And I was very fond of spending time outside the school, though I was trying to learn something. When I entered a college and subsequently a university and then another university and yet another university to do 2 MAs and a PhD, I was questioning myself constantly. And the question was again and again, like in music, you got the Drupad, you go back to refrain as we describe it in English poetry. The refrain was, what is knowledge? What is it? Is it a process? Is it a product? Is it an impact on my neural system? Is it an impact on my emotions? How do I assess it? How do I know it? Who says that X has knowledge and Y does not have it? Those questions used to bother me to no end all through my years of study. While I was very comfortable reading books and writing about them, and writing dissertations and getting through the formal requirements of examination. My research guide was a scholar. I studied in Maharashtra, and my research guide was a Kannada scholar. He was a novelist. He was quite a well-known novelist of his time, Shantinath Desai. Uh, Professor Desai said to me in the first meeting, as when I met him as a research student and him as my research guide, he said, your entire PhD is all about asking questions. It is not about putting the commas at the right place or putting the full stops at the right place or writing your notes and referencing and all that you can, if you go to a good library, you can easily learn that. But a library will not teach you how to ask good questions. Research will. And so for the first time, when I started doing research, my supervisor presented to me a part of the answer I was looking for through my school and college years and university years. And that question was, of course, what is knowledge? So Professor Desai told me that knowledge was the ability to question. I, of course, continued further in my pursuit. And I found that most of the philosophical answers available were going in a circuitous manner. For instance, in Panini, in Panini's Sutra part, not Ashtadhyayi, the Sutra part, the second work. He raises the same question. I was a bit surprised. He faced the same question as I did, and so there is a conversation, as Panini writes. The conversation goes like this: the first person asks a question, what is well said? What is a good piece of research? I mean, what is a properly formed text? And the answer is the Upadishta, the well said, is what the elite in the society say. Then the next question is who are the elite? So the answer is the ones who speak well are the elites. So good speech is what the elites offer, and elites are the ones who speak well, is not a good way of providing an answer as to what is knowledge. It only says that knowledge is a sociological animal, it is a sociological figment. It's a kind of an imagination of a society within which some people are imagined to have knowledge, some people are imagined to have questions and answers and found answers for those questions. I tried to go to Plato and Socrates to figure out if they knew any better. And my finding was that they were even worse than Panini. Panini at least provided a logical description of an illogical process. In Plato, the description of an illogical process was also illogical. I therefore remained extremely uncomfortable with myself because I was in the business of knowledge. I was doing research, I was teaching research, I used to go to classroom and lecture to my students. And every time I was lecturing, somewhere at the back of my mind was this doubt as to what am I doing precisely? Am I producing knowledge, or am I just carrying some knowledge from one down to another offloading place? What was my role? All these questions became very intense, and finally, I decided to write a little book about what is knowledge and what colonialism has done to knowledge. And that book came out under the title After Amnesia. When I was writing that book, because the fashion of the day was to write more about colonialism, my book was also more about colonialism. But I must share with you that while I was writing about literary criticism during colonial times or social sciences during colonial times, a social science like literary criticism and linguistics, I knew that I was thinking more about memory. And as I was working on that book, it hit my thoughts, it hit my mind that memory plays an extremely crucial role in development of knowledge. Now, when I say this, I'm not speaking about an individual's knowing. I'm not speaking about an individual's consciousness. I'm speaking about knowledge as a social phenomenon, a collective phenomenon. Much later, when I was with some scholars in universities outside India who were working on the memory of the Second World War, particularly the memory of the Jews, the memories of victimhood, and how they're structured. It became even more uh, obvious to me that what shapes knowledge is memory. What was still not obvious to me, and what I discovered even further down my journey, further much later, through a very phenomenal work by an Italian American scholar called Rossi, who has written a book, almost a tome called "The Art and the Art and the Science of Memory." When I was reading Rossi's book, and I recommend it to everybody who is in the business of knowledge in whatever way: school teacher, college teacher, university teacher, research student, or just somebody doing meditation on some subject in order to get uh, pradnya, in order to get knowledge. Rossi's work says that because the human brain is structured in a peculiar way, because it is a recursive brain, it handles memory in much different a way than it would have handled memory had the brain not been recursive brain. Let me explain this. A recursive brain is the brain that intuits thoughts in the minds of another person. For instance, while I am speaking to you, of course, we're not physically together in the same space. But had we been in the same space, and if I had been speaking to you, looking at you, or you looking at me, I would have figured out what are the thoughts going on in your inside your mind or head. Or you would have figured out when I say half a sentence, what the remaining part of my sentence would be. This ability to think about thought is the recursive quality or property of the brain. Other animals experience life. The brains of other animals control their bodies, drive their bodies through even through difficulties, and understand the world for the brains understand the world for those specific animals or members of the species. But it is the human brain which alone thinks, and in addition to thinking, it thinks about thinking, it thinks about thought. And that's what led human beings to invent language for expressing thought about thinking. Language is not primarily about a reference. Language is not for me to refer to the apple that is falling. Language is for someone like Newton to refer to that apple while falling and say, here are my thoughts when I experience an apple falling, and this is my first law of gravitation. The recursive brain produces thoughts which are outside an individual's body and the mind. These are thoughts which start resting between you and me, not just inside my mind, or not just inside your minds, but between your minds and my mind. And these accumulated thoughts become, as Rossi says, what we call knowledge. So knowledge is this impersonal stock of thoughts that humans have produced. Of course, we know that we know that though such collected, accumulated stock of knowledge is memory of so many humans, thoughts of so many humans. These take the form of schools, universities, museums, libraries, and so on. And to a point, it is relatively easy to handle such stock of thought and memory. To a certain point, it is possible to create mnemonics, memory tricks to recall large data that one has to remember. For instance, when I was a child, and my teacher of physics was teaching me the names of the colors in the color spectrum, I used to remember just the first initial letter of those colors, and in Marathi, ta, na, pi, hi, ni, pa, za, and I knew the names of all the colors. So one can make sutras, one can make abridgment of units of knowledge for the convenience of memory, and memorize those abridged units of knowledge and take them forward to the next generation. But when this transaction becomes far too complex, when the load, that memory, the collective memory load, not an individual's memory, the collective memory load, the knowledge load becomes too much for an individual learner or teacher to recall easily, one starts inventing new methods. In the 17th century, practically in every discipline in Europe, these new methods were being invented. For example, in chemistry, they had prepared a periodic table, that is, various properties of elements could be remembered very easily if they were placed inside it, an easy to remember, easy to grasp table. So every chemical was given a certain number, 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 108 or 109. Elements, these were seen as elements, and there were interrelations of elements that the table made very clear. Similarly, in physics, in arithmetic, in algebra, in geometry, I mean, after all, algebra itself is a formation of a sutra for understanding very complex reality. Trigonometry is a very complex reality made easy. Now, different disciplines had different methods of remembering the collected memory. Different disciplines had different methods of documenting, storing the knowledge load, the knowledge stock that humans had produced. It was a French scientist, a French thinker, Leibniz, who finally hit upon a method of uniting all these different methods of remembering. Initially, there was only the human brain speaking to another human brain. Subsequently came an objective knowledge. Then came a complicated load of knowledge. Then came mnemonics to recall that complicated load of knowledge. Then came disciplines with their own tricks, memory tricks to remember all the knowledge gathered in those disciplines. And finally came a single formula given by Leibniz, which said that you can break down any element, any aspect, uh, uh, any part of the collected knowledge of human beings. You can break it down to and represent that breakdown if you use a string of zeros and ones, because you will have limitless zeros and numberless ones available to you, and no two representations of the string would be similar. So you can accommodate all the knowledge in the world using the string of zeros and ones. This was a unique method that Leibniz invented. This method made it possible for scientists from one discipline to know knowledge in another discipline, because this via media, this particular formula could translate knowledge from one discipline to another discipline. In short, knowledge was made universally accessible. Very often we say, Western knowledge is universal. It does not mean that the Western knowledge knows all about the universe, or it does not mean that the Western knowledge knows all about, all about the non-West. It is universal in the sense that the method used for recording knowledge, recording truth about the world, is using a method which will allow access to anybody who knows that method, and only in that limited sense it is universal knowledge. Now, this universal knowledge was developing in the West during the 17th century, the 18th century, and the 19th century. This universal knowledge was different from the kind of knowledge tradition that we had. And I'm not talking about traditions of books, or tradition of mantras, or vachanas, or tradition of craft, and I'm talking about tradition of how knowledge is stored, how experience is experience, how an observation attains the status of knowledge, how answer to a difficult question attains the status of knowledge. That is knowledge. I'm talking about that knowledge. And in India, the tradition of knowledge was of a different nature. Here, knowledge was authenticated by the validation of the experience of the knowledger. The one who produced knowledge had to authenticate his or her experience, his or her experience of knowledge gaining, and therefore all knowledge was seen as some kind of descending realization coming from above inside our minds or brains or hearts, inside our chitta. So what manifested within chitta as some kind of descent from above was validated by the experiencer, the person experiencing, as knowledge. And therefore, it was a self certified knowledge, not verifiable knowledge, not verified knowledge. Though methods of verification were available in India, for knowledge to become knowledge, verification was not necessary. I'm not saying that India lacked methods of verification. I'm saying that Indian understanding of knowledge was of a different kind. These two understandings of knowledge came in conflict during the colonial times. One was a universal knowledge, another was a self authenticated knowledge. And therefore, the two could not be fitted with each other with any ease. One had to reject one and accept another, or one had to make some fraudulent attempts at synthesizing the two. Many such false attempts, false starts were made to synthesize the two, but they did not succeed. Colonialism, therefore, is the first wound, mortal wound, in the knowledge tradition of India. The second mortal wound that knowledge tradition in India has, and I am coming to a conclusion now. I will stop in a few minutes' time. The second mortal wound that Indian knowledge stock has received is the caste system, because the makers of things and their experiences were not allowed to contribute to development of knowledge, and therefore it remained restricted to only certain kind of knowing. But all kinds of knowings were not accommodated within the knowledge stock of India. That other kinds of knowing were not authenticated as knowledge. Indian knowledge is carrying two brunts, two wounds. It's a crisis of knowledge that India has. And because our research methodology, ethics, none of these have really stared at these two wounds in the face, despite having several hundred universities and several lakh researchers. We are still not able to produce really very good research which will have universal respect. I'm not speaking about not getting the Nobel Prizes. I mean, that's not a measure of the great knowledge. But the knowledge which can be useful for the society, knowledge which can transform the society, we have still not started producing it. I said at the beginning of my lecture that I have spent my entire life in either studying or doing research or writing books or teaching, and I regret, I repent. I had said it about myself. Uh, my ethics in my research should have been first to make sure that I fit into the society for which I am doing research. I did not do it. I failed, and therefore, even if I produce some, lovely books, I think I did not use my life properly and fully. If I get another life, I'll do research differently. I'll know what knowledge is, why it is produced, for whom it is produced, and what would be the ethics of knowledge production in a place like our country. If we had produced knowledge observing ethics, we would not be experiencing mob lynchings of scheduled castes in this country, or marginalization of the nomadic communities in this country, or heaping insults on women and so many rapes every day in this country. The knowledge, our ethics cannot be about a discipline or a subject. Our ethics in knowledge will have to be much broader. I'm sorry, friends, that what I said is probably irrelevant to what you expected from me. It's not what you expected from me. but I'm saying this at the end of a 50 years of experience of knowledge cultivation with utmost sincerity. Thank you very much.